Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of Mrs. Sarojini Hegde, all of us from the Hegde family, we are extremely pleased to welcome you to this sixth edition of the Professor KTM Hegde Memorial Lecture. It is so special to see all of you after a 2-year gap. These 2 years have been very difficult for all of us as a family, and all of you have seen the same pain across all the families. We have lost our brother Sujan Hegde, and we miss him deeply. He was deeply involved in the organization of this memorial in all the years, but I'm sure he is here with us in spirit today. To all those of you who have not known Professor Hegde, he was a professional who dedicated the 40 plus years of his academic life to the study of archaeology and ancient history of the Indian subcontinent. An MA from the University of Cambridge and a doctorate from MSU Baroda. He also had multiple fellowships for teaching and research at several respected academic institutions, including St. John's College, University of Cambridge, England, Harvard University, US, and Wolfson College, Oxford University. He has published over 70 research papers in well-known Indian and foreign research journals. He is the author and co-author of a number of books on ancient metals, prominent among them being An Introduction to Ancient Indian Metallurgy and Early Indian Metallurgy. Under his leadership as head of archaeology and ancient history, and later as the Dean of Faculty of Arts at MS University, the archaeology department enjoyed global academic interest and support. The Ford Foundation in New York recognized the work and offered a grant which boosted the scientific temper and progress of the Department of Archaeology in a significant way. It is in dedication to this pursuit of academic excellence and his deep appreciation of the arts which prompts us to invite eminent guests who help in the celebration of the human spirit. We warmly welcome our two guests for today, Professor Alok Rai and Anwar Khan and his troupe, who have kindly consented to be here for this event. I'd like to give a small introduction of Professor Alok Rai. Professor Alok Rai is a doctorate in modern English literature, and he has been a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford, as well as a Commonwealth Fellow at the University College of London. His PhD dissertation was written on George Orwell, which was later published as a book, Orwell and the Politics of Despair, in 1990. He has taught for many years at the University of Allahabad, at the Indian Institute of Technology, Delhi, and University of Pennsylvania. Professor Rai grew up in Allahabad and has an impeccable literary lineage, being the grandson of Munshi Premchand and the son of Amrit Rai. In the words of Professor Rai, Munshi Premchand changed the face of Hindu and Urdu literature by incorporating his modern outlook and lucid articulations. His father, Amrit Rai, continued the contribution to Indian literature with several books written in Hindi. Professor Rai never saw his grandfather, who died at a young age, and also had the influence of his father, Amrit Rai, in the early years of his life. However, being born in this family gave him, well before the age of consent, a certain engagement with matters of language and culture with literature. Perhaps it is this legacy that has given him the increasingly rare capacity for expressing himself with felicity in Hindi and Urdu in addition to English. He has translated Munshi Premchand's Nirmala, a personal favorite of mine. Professor Rai has also inherited from this legacy a great love for these languages in their original, perhaps purer, creative, dynamic, and spoken form, rather than the metamorphized and Sanskritized version that it is today. He talks about this topic in his book Hindi Nationalism, which was published in 2001. His topic today is of great relevance and interest to us, where he will speak to us about the wisdom of Hindustani. Welcome, Professor Rai.
Just a minor announcement before Professor Rai starts. May I request all of you to put off your mobile. Let it not be on so-called silent television. Put it off. Thank you.
Close. Chakra dale. Close. Can I put organize? You can see this. इसके लिए जगह छोड़ दीजिए माफी जगह नजीक नहीं है ठीक अच्छा I am audible. I'm probably going to be more than audible because I tend to shout. Sorry, excuse me. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, friends. I'm delighted to be here, but let me also say that I'm more than a little nervous. It is over 2 years since I did anything like this, and I expect I am a little rusty, so please bear with me. I would like to place on record, formally, my appreciation of and admiration for the way in which the Hegde family has chosen to celebrate the illustrious career of Professor Hegde himself. That to have chosen such an enlightened and creative way itself says something very good about him and his legacy. So that. My theme today is the wisdom of Hindustani. And while I will try and speak about the wisdom of Hindustani, I must make it clear right at the outset that I'm making no such claim about my reflections on the wisdom of Hindustani. So please bear with me. My theme is, but I'm not quite sure whether what I do is necessarily that. So basically, what I'm trying to say is in the context of a few framing questions or concerns. So I'm trying to locate what I'm saying in the context of a few concerns. And the most immediate of these is a book by the Columbia historian Mannan Ahmed Asif. It's a book that has just been published. It's called The Loss of Hindustan, The Invention of India. Okay, it's just out. It is a brilliant work. I cannot recommend it too strongly. But anyway, the central question that Asif asks is, what happened to Hindustan? Hindustan was a regular entity. It existed. It was to be seen on maps. It was found in travelogues, in histories, in philological works. Plays that wanted to signal their authenticity all mentioned Hindustan. But Asif's argument is really a historian's argument. It is about how colonial historians leaned on the Persian historical archive, but along with leaning on that archive, they managed to erase the idea and the name of Hindustan from the record. But this Hindustan then begins to fade from the colonial archive, and gradually Hindustan is replaced by the idea of India. And these two concepts are significantly different. And my argument about Hindustani is partly in this context. This Hindustan, incidentally, and Farishta's history is Farishta is the prime source, is Asif's key text. And Hindustan is always identified as Hindustan Jannat Nishan, i.e., it is like paradise. And so I wanted to read to you, this is a place of unimaginable richness. It is a place of beauty, of harmony, of diversity. And so I wanted to give you a few snippets of how this Hindustan Jannat Nishan was actually conceptualized. This is from Amir Khusro. It's 124. Amir Khusro writing in the 14th century. So Khusro provides 7 arguments based on logic and reason, he assures us, in support of his assertion that Hindustan is heaven itself. The first of these has to do with the fact that Hindustan's climate, believe it or not, matches heaven's climate, which is why when Adam fell from heaven, he landed in Hindustan and he felt immediately at home. As it happens, Eve did not fall in Hindustan. She fell in Jeddah, of all places. So he fetched her from Jeddah, but they were happy in Hindustan because the climate of Hindustan is the climate of heaven itself. The second argument, I will not give you all 7, but believe me, they are fun. The second argument is that God also expelled the peacock from heaven. And so the peacock too came to India and felt immediately at home. Then there are, this is probably relevant. The snake was also expelled from heaven and does exist in multiple places in the world, but Hindustan is the only place where it does not bite until it is provoked. All right. Some of you may not be inclined to believe this now, but at least in the world of Amir Khusro, the snake in India was special. It was a snake from paradise. However, this Hindustan fades from the colonial archive, and it continues to exist, however, because even in 1857, poor, reduced Bahadur Shah Zafar, nominally leading the revolt of 1857, is still Shahanshah-e-Hindustan. Right? The Iqbal talks about Sare Jahan se Achha, Hindustan Hamara. The INA, the greeting that the INA uses is Jai Hindustan, which gets abbreviated to Jai Hind. But it is Hindustan. The idea of Hindustan persists as a kind of anti-colonial concept of the place. Okay, so this basically, this Hindustan is replaced by India, and this India is a place, interestingly, unlike the beauty and the harmony and everything else that characterizes Hindustan, India is a place of frozen dogmatisms locked in endless strife. Sounds familiar? And no doubt needing the firmly benign hand of the colonizer to keep it from violent anarchy. So, this work, Asif's work on Hindustan, the loss of Hindustan, and the idea of India is one of my concerns. My second framing concern has to do not so much with Hindustan or the loss of Hindustan, but the loss of Hindustani. Now, oddly enough, Hindustani is practically missing from Asif's account of the loss of Hindustan. This is an absence which I noticed immediately. Now, in my mind, the loss of Hindustan and the loss of Hindustani are intimately connected. I.e., the story of the loss of Hindustan cannot be understood without also understanding what happened to Hindustani. And this story, this is partly the story that I've tried to tell in my book, Hindi Nationalism. So, as is evident from my title, obviously, Hindi is intimate, the question of Hindi and the making of Hindi is intimately connected with nationalism. But even prior, which is why I insist on talking about Hindi nationalism as distinct from Hindu nationalism. All right. However, prior to the question of Hindi nationalism, there is yet another question, which is the question of the emergence of the Hindi Pradesh. Now, what is this Hindi Pradesh? Because this Hindi Pradesh is more or less the same as what used to be Hindustan. So, my second framing concern has to do with the making of the Hindi Pradesh. And as is obvious to me, there has to be a connection between Hindi and the making of the Hindi Pradesh. However, and I have tried this out with many Hindi intellectuals, they are curiously reluctant to admit that there might be such a connection. Because the image of modern Hindi is intimately connected in the imagination of modern establishment Hindi with ideas of liberation and modernity. So the counter suggestion that in the making of the most backward part of the country, the Hindi Pradesh, Hindi might have a role to play is one that they are very reluctant to admit. However, it is a question that I keep probing even with them, and that is one of the questions that I want to again place on the table. Right? Even if one insists that the invention of India is a colonial product, all right, the British created India, all right, in the actual grind of the making of the independent nation state of India, that is Bharat, to give it its full name, full constitutional name, this country shall be known as India, that is Bharat. So in the making of India, that is Bharat, and even more so now, in the making of what we are pleased to call New India, the Hindi Pradesh, for better and for worse, plays a very important part. Now, in speaking about this important part, I must insist particularly here that I don't want to claim all the credit for it. I'm a UP wala myself, but I would like to suggest that there are other local dynamics also at play. I have coastal Karnataka in mind, I have Gujarat in mind. So there are other local dynamics also which are driving the making of New India. But I would suggest that Hindi also, and therefore the Hindi Pradesh, has a role to play. So concern number 2. However, there is yet another matter that I have to address again in a kind of prefatory mode, if you will. This has to do with the fact that Hindustani is a curiously spectral thing. It both is and it isn't. In this respect, I suppose, it is like God, both inescapable and invisible. Still, jokes apart, this curiously ghostly Hindustani continues, as is appropriate for ghosts, I suppose, to haunt the linguistic debate in our country. So even though Hindustani doesn't exist, it still continues to figure in our discourse. A ghostly being, however, implies a prior unghostly existence, obviously. But it appears that Hindustani has been ectoplasmic, ghostly, for a very long time. So, on the 9th of November 1948, in the Constituent Assembly, Ghanshyam Das Gupta reported, quote, "I was in search of simple Hindustani. I could not find it in the constitutional proceedings. I could not find it in the law books. The official proceedings of this house are published in 3 languages: English, Hindi, and Urdu. I read English, I read Hindi, and please note, I got read Urdu. I read Hindi, I read English, I got read Urdu with the idea that I might be able to find what they call simple Hindustani. I could not find it. Urdu was Urdu and Hindi was Hindi. There was no such thing as simple Hindustani. It is only in the bazaar that I could find simple Hindustani. When we cannot have simple Hindustani, even in elementary school books, how can our laws be made in it? Okay. Ironically, the volumes that record these debates describe the language in which the arguments are being made as Hindustani. But at the end of these debates, when the 8th schedule was being drawn up, the schedule of Indian languages was being drawn up, the list of 14 languages did not include Hindustani. It is an alphabetical listing. It starts with Assamese, it ends with Urdu, and Sanskrit. Urdu is at number 13, by the way, and Sanskrit is an evident afterthought, which is why you get 14. So Sanskrit is 10A. Now clearly 10A suggests that someone needed to push it in right at the end. What about Sanskrit? So that's it. Okay, so I was suggesting that, like other famous ghosts, Banquo's ghost, Hamlet's father, the ghost of Hindustani also probably has something important to tell us. The language deliberations of the Constituent Assembly, I don't know whether many of you have had a chance to look at the Constituent Assembly debates, but language was particularly contentious. And so, in their wisdom, in his wisdom, Rajendra Prasad, who was the president of the Constituent Assembly, kept putting off the question of language. Every time the question of language came up, there was a fight and there would be no Constituent Assembly, it would break up. So he said, okay, not now, let's do it later. They had more stuff. When they had enough stuff in the bag for the idea of abandoning the whole process altogether to be unthinkable, then at the very end, the question of language was taken up. Interestingly enough, of course, the problem was with the one language that was being proposed as the secret to the unity of India. That what will unify India? One language. And that one language, of course, there was some, as you know, some controversy about what that one language would be. All right? Because prior to the Constituent Assembly debates, the language was Hindustani. Everyone understood that the language of Hindustan will be Hindustani. However, by the time we get to the Constituent Assembly debates, the climate has worsened and it's no longer Hindustani. And then the greatest danger to the unity of the country then and now becomes Hindi. That even though Hindi is supposed to be the solution to the problem, it becomes itself the problem. Okay, so prior to the Constituent Assembly, I had a quote from Grierson here from 1916 in the Linguistic Survey. He says that Hindustani is so well known a language that it would be a waste of space to give more than the merest sketch of its grammar. Only a few decades later, 1916, 1948, people don't believe it exists at all. It has disappeared. Interestingly, the phrase that was used by Seth Govindas again in the Constituent Assembly was not that Hindustani does not exist, but he said the question of Hindustani does not exist. And there's a subtle difference. So the question of Hindustani does not exist, is what he says. Okay, and in the slippage from Hindustani to the question of Hindustani, again, there is a whole story that is involved. Census data offers an illustration, and actually this is probably repeating stuff you know already. Census data offers an illustration of just what is going on with language in this terrible time. So between 1931 and 1951, the two censuses, the numbers of people claiming Hindustani as their mother tongue in UP declined by 86.4% and 98.5% in the period 1951 to 1961. Now, we are talking UP figures here. We are talking about tens of millions of people. They can't suddenly disappear. Obviously, what is happening is that people's identities are shifting through language. They're being defined through languages. Okay? However, irrespective of whether we are dealing with the exaggerated reports of the demise of Hindustani or its life after death as a ghost, the fact of the matter is that the question of Hindustani, irrespective of what Said Govindas said, refuses to lie down and stay dead. Dead it may be, but it keeps getting up. Okay. I've written here that I hope I'm not taxing your patience with my alap, because this is still only alap, believe me. I'll get to the fast stuff later. But my theme is the loss of Hindustani and the role that Hindi plays in the loss of Hindustani. Now, I promise not to dally here too long, but there is one, again, interesting and possibly unrealized matter here, which has to do with the matter of Hindi's virgin birth. All right, now let me explain. This Hindi's virgin birth is extremely important because, of course, this matter of cultural virginity is very important and keeps recurring in different forms. Now, we have all encountered in school, at least some of you are young enough to remember school, right? We have all encountered this thing about Hindi being the Jyeshtaputri of Sanskrit. All right? Now, and while on some accounts, by the way, Hindi is the Jyeshtaputri, but as in a proper family, there are other relatives also. But interestingly enough, and correct me if I'm wrong, there is never any mention of a father. So the Hindi is the Jyeshtaputri, where is the Pita? So there are some Mossis, by the way, but there are no Buas, interestingly. There are Mossis, but there are no Buas. So Old Persian is probably a Mossi. All right? But the only claim to masculinity in this linguistic universe is actually made ironically in respect of, and this is, I'm sorry, this is going too far. How am I doing? Badly, huh? Okay? All right, okay. The only claim to masculinity is made in respect of Khadi Boli Hindi. Khadi Boli Hindi is what becomes Hindi, right? Everybody is told. Now, Khadi Boli is, as you know, feminine. As the name would suggest, I mean, we know enough Hindi to know, Khadi Boli is Hindi. However, in the contention with Braj Bhasha, which is being rejected in favor of Khadi Boli, Braj Bhasha becomes Padi Boli, and Khadi Boli becomes, somewhat phallically, forgive me, male. So they talk about Khadi Boli as being masculine compared to Braj Bhasha. However, in my mind, Khadi Boli Hindi, which is born virginally and also aspires to virginity through energetically rejecting Tadbhava pollution. All right? This longing for Tatsamata, longing for some original pure form is what defines modern Hindi. All right, and this is something that I like to think of as describe to myself as the Gurugram complex. The Gurugram complex is a sort of yearning for a time before, before the pollutions of history, before the pollutions of time, before the corruptions of becoming happened, there was a pure state, and that pure state is miraculously attainable magically by some pots of paint. But anyway, I must get back to my theme of Hindustani. Now, what happened to Hindustani? The real history, as opposed to the Jeshtaputri history, has to do with the emergence of two parallel registers. There's the Urdu register, which emerges in the last years of the Mughal dynasties, and the Hindi register, which emerges essentially late 19th century and early 20th century. Now, it is important in my mind to understand both these processes, the emergence of the one register in the last years of the Mughal dynasty in the 18th century, early 18th century, and the emergence of the Hindi register in the late 19th, early 20th century with Bhartendu Mandal and after the Bhartendu Mandal. Both these processes are not natural. They involve doing by particular people in particular contexts. One. So that is one process that needs to be understood. Then the further sectarian or communal identification of these literary registers with Hindus and Muslims is again not given. Clearly, Urdu is not Muslim. At some point and through some process, Urdu becomes Muslim. All right. So again, in order, basically these things which appear entirely natural to us, I'm suggesting are not natural at all. They are historical processes which involve historical actors doing things in historical contexts. However, these histories of doings are the subject that I deal with in my book. All right. My theme here today is not the doing, but the implicit and collateral undoing, which is that through these processes of doing, what is undone is the basis of Hindustani. So, in this sense, the loss of Hindustani and therefore the loss of Hindustan. Now, excuse me, just a second. See, Mannan Asif writes about the loss of Hindustan from the perspective of the historians. Okay, and while the characteristics of Hindustan are well identified, beauty, harmony, cultural diversity, and so on, the location of this Hindustan is not quite so specific. Where is Hindustan? Okay, and the language Hindustani is entirely incidental to Mannan Asif's account of the loss of Hindustan. Now, what I am proposing to do, the crux of my argument basically is, what I'm proposing is that what one needs to do is simply to reverse Asif's priority. So that whereas for him, Hindustani is secondary to Hindustan, what I'm proposing is that Hindustani has priority over Hindustan, i.e. Hindustan is the space, real and imaginary, where Hindustani is the language. So that even where Hindustan does not exist as an administrative, political entity, because it does not. For much of this period, Hindustan is not one single unit. Hindustan is a different kind of space, and what I'm suggesting is that Hindustan is basically a linguistic space. Hindustan is the space of Hindustani. Okay, so that basically हिंदुस्तानी का वजूद हिंदुस्तान से नहीं है, हिंदुस्तान का वजूद हिंदुस्तानी से. You know, see, that is basically the crux of my argument. The conception of Hindustan that emerges from these pre-colonial histories is obviously, as I said, diversity, hybridization, and so on. The classic line is Firag Gorakhpuri's line, काफिले बसते गए हिंदुस्तान बनता गया. काफिले बसते गए हिंदुस्तान बनता गया. The particular beauty of Hindustani, and I mean the language now, consists precisely in its deep cosmopolitanism. Its loose and loose-limbed structure can accommodate multiple tonalities, registers, nuances. It is a poet's delight, but it drives grammarians to madness. Unlike more rigorously defined languages, Hindustani is a difficult language to master. One can always tell a native user from one who has merely picked it from a book. My sons-in-law, who are both not Indian, try and learn Hindustani, and it provides us endless joy to hear them trying to speak Hindustani. So, but on the other hand, it is the easiest language if you want to get by in this country. In most of it, you use some version of Hindustani in order to get by. So, basically, with this loose structure, which can range widely from multiple classical resources, multiple tonalities, all right? I could easily talk at length about the beauty of Hindustani, all right? And at this point, I would easily start drawing upon the resources of Shairi and so on and so forth, and try and illustrate what might be called the beauty of Hindustani. All right? Ye sham bhi kahan hui. But I don't want to do that, in the sense that my argument today is not about the beauty of Hindustani. It is, and it's a challenge I've set myself, it is on the wisdom of Hindustani. So that's not easy, but let me try and address the question of the wisdom of Hindustani and not merely its beauty, which is easy. Language at its most general, and I mean language per se, is a reaching out to otherness. Right? It's reaching out to otherness in two senses. Right? One, it is a reaching out to the sensory flux, the undifferentiated sensory flux of the world, which becomes a world only through being organized as language. Until language can parcel out the world in concepts, categories, ranges, domains, it is an undifferentiated flux. So in that sense, language is a reaching out to the otherness of the world. Language is also, obviously, a reaching out to otherness in the sense of reaching out to other people. By definition, my negative illustration for this, of course, is that when, as it were, lovers in this ideal state transcend otherness and become one, then there is no need for language. Indeed, this is often testified, right? That the need for language disappears because there is no otherness left. But while there is otherness, one needs language, all right? And the sense of community that all of us have experienced hearing a fragment of one's language in a foreign country immediately creates a kind of bond. So this reaching out is essential to language, and my argument is that these reachings out, both outwards and inwards, or both towards the world and socially, these reachings out and the memory of these reachings out are retained within the cultural memory of languages themselves. So that languages that develop in high, narrow valleys, as we know, right, dialects which are spoken by very few people, are different languages. Languages that exist at cultural crossroads, at civilizational crossroads, have done so for centuries, become different simply because they've absorbed more influences than anybody realizes. So that for instance, our everyday language is an etymologist's despair, because there's no telling where these words are coming from. Every so often one encounters a word and you don't know where it's from, which civilizational encounter and which century, where has produced this fragment, which we use entirely naturally. So, for me, the abiding mystery of Hindustani, the source of its beauty and its wisdom, derives from the fact that while its stable being, right, what is Hindustani? Where is Hindustani? Is it here? Is it there? Whereas its stable being and its precise location might be difficult to identify, right? I remember Ghanshyam Das Gupta saying, "मैं ढूंढने गया था, यहाँ ढूंढा, वहाँ ढूंढा, कहीं नहीं मिली," है ना? But it identifies, more importantly, it identifies a dynamic, communicative intention. Hindustani is, at one level, it is an attitude. It is a reaching out. A reaching out to multiple communities, a reaching out for community and across diversity. It is born precisely out of the situations that were produced by diversities. Okay. I'm coming to the end, I think. I'll show you. I don't want to go on. No, sorry. I realize I'm running a risk here. But anyway, since I've stuck my neck out, let me stick it out a little further. Okay. In speaking about the wisdom of Hindustani, I'm leaning on an idea that I find fertile, even though it is a difficult one to hold on to. This is the idea that language is a living thing. In this conception of language, dictionaries are graveyards, and grammars are merely textbooks of linguistic anatomy. A living language, and we use the metaphor quite naturally. We talk about a living language. We talk about living languages. What does it mean for a language to live, to be alive? Right? Goes about its business of living, as we all do, in the particular places in which it finds itself, with intents and purposes. If it's living, it must intend, it must want to do something. I don't mean this entirely, what I'm going to say next, I don't mean entirely non-seriously. Our experience of the virus pandemic does not have much to recommend it, but the virus has taught us to be aware that there are many different kinds of living, that there are, as it were, different kinds of sentience. Thus, escaping from the dictionary, the word, like the virus, comes alive. The word comes alive when it finds a suitable host. Having found such a host, it becomes capable of being able to replicate and thrive. And even as dictionary makers know to their cost, words mutate, new meanings develop, words across centuries, words become unrecognizable. I mean, our word for king, and what first thing that comes to mind, used to be the word for cunning. And so that, so the dairy for the König is cunning, which now, of course, king has lost the sense of cunning. All right, it's only king. So now, I don't wish to push this virus analogy too far, but languages live through the people who use them, and thus carry within their evolving form the memory and patterns of those histories of use, of shared living. This Hindustani, through which Hindustan Jannat Nishan had its being, is a precious resource of that deep cultural experience, of the wisdom that is born of coexisting with multiple differences. The secret alchemy that transfigures, I'm trying to find a page that I might have lost. Found. The secret alchemy that basically transfigures diversity into vivacity. So that secret is available within the language. And what I wrote here was that the experience of language is always a shared collective experience. And it is in this sense that I believe Hindustani embodies a deep civilizational wisdom, just as certain other languages are and can be, and are perhaps even intended to be, instruments of exclusion, vehicles of toxicity, and embodiments of civilizational brutality. And I'm afraid Hindustani provides examples of both. Leaning on Manna Nasif's book, I've talked mainly in the register of loss, because of course Manna Nasif talks in the register of loss. I would like to turn briefly to talk about recovery and possibly the recovery of Hindustani and perhaps even the recovery of Hindustan. The fact of the matter is that linguistic purists, and by the way, I'm not a linguistic purist at all. I'm not one for linguistic purity. I believe languages grow by being impure. And linguistic purists, who have always existed, are unable to destroy a living language. And so, the metaphor that is used most frequently in the literature is the metaphor of grass. That you can trample upon the grass, but once the rains come, the grass grows back. All right? And so, even though I know, and, and there are people who would argue that languages die, and I also recognize that languages can die, I would like to think that it is also possible that where languages can die, that one can actually use the life that lives within a language, the inherent life of a language, as itself a resource, because it carries encoded within it, that language carries encoded within it, a civilizational memory, a token of a lost possibility, of a path that not taken is perhaps too final, that we seem to be or have forgotten about. I'll stop here. Thank you very much. Okay, I'm done. Fiddling out my glasses. I can certainly try. Okay.
So I'll just have another mic.
Okay.
Yeah. So, any questions for Professor Rai?
Professor Roy, it was a great topic that we talked about. And I think at the end you talked about languages are transformative. Now, I'm not a linguist, I'm not a scholar, nothing. I'm just looking at language and I see a transformation happening in my lifespan. And what you talked about Hindustani, if I look at before the 10th, 11th century when the Muslim invasion took place in India and the Persian influence came, before that there was no concept of Hindustani. The languages spoken were very diverse depending on the region. So that's my assertion, and maybe I'm wrong, but I'm thinking that the concept of Hindustani came from the Persians, and that Hindustani concept has transmuted and got subsumed by this colonial interface that happened after the 17th century when the British came in. So, as a natural progression, the Hindustani concept has to move on and assimilate these new influences that are happening in our society, in our culture. And so the Hindustani, should we be lamenting the loss of Hindustani, or should we be talking about that there is a new type of Hindustani being created? Maybe it's not the same that we saw in the 17th, 18th century, but it's a different version of that. And maybe we don't know what it is. Maybe do not understand what it is because it is so different that it is the newness is very sometimes it's strange, I would say, and not very easy to grasp. That's my thought when I heard your speech, because I saw that it's a transformation. It will keep on happening. And will this change should be lamented, or should we say how can we make this change more? Internalize it and understand where these Hindustani loss or assimilation of other languages, is it enriching it? Is it denuding it? I don't know. That's the thought that came into my mind.
As a matter of fact, you're saying basically what I've been trying to say. So thank you very much, because I do not wish to speak in the register. The Asif's book is about the loss of Hindustan. I'm talking about the recovery of Hindustan through Hindustani, because Hindustani itself is impossible to destroy, and indeed to understand what is Hindustan also, one does not need political or administrative entities, one needs to approach it through language. That the place where Hindustani is the language is Hindustan. And I would say the same, that in this space of Hindustan, there are unfortunately other languages also, all right, which are seeking not reaching across difference, but of exclusion, all right. That's to say, languages, as I said, have intentions, have purposes, and the purpose that drives. So you're perfectly right that Hindustani today is not the same as Hindustani in the 18th century or the 19th century. Certainly not. Of course, it is but that is the living language. That is the living language, and it lives in popular culture more than anywhere else. That Hindustani is living in popular culture, and it is what, to my mind, it is important to recognize that as a strength, as a cultural resource, rather than something which is to be lamented. So I'm not someone who is a kind of who is lamenting the loss of something or longing for a return to some earlier version of the language. By all means, bring on the change. All right? The more the better, frankly.
Good evening, sir. This is Ashish Kotecha from the Department of Political Science. Sir, as you have spoke that Hindustani ka wajud Hindustan se nahi, Hindustani ka wajud Hindustan se hai. Sir, when we look the formation of the identity in terms of caste, language, creed, religion, but when we see the formation of the identity on the multiple attributes, like it also contains the language, region, caste, So where do you see the interest of the Hindustani? Is it the discovery of the Hindustani or the recovery of the Hindustani?
Good question. Good question. I'm sorry, I have a bit of a hearing problem. So you got to forgive me. But you're talking about basically the metaphor of recovery is problematic. All right, and I'm you see when recovery, discovery, all of those imply a prior whole which can be recovered. I'm not. I would go along with this later understanding, which is that it is a dynamic set of purposes and intentions. That what made Hindustani is not a snapshot of its form at any particular time, but the communicative intentions and purposes that informed its development over time. So that whatever came, it absorbed and made its own. And the challenge of the now is always that there is new stuff that needs to be absorbed. And that is, to my mind, a strength, not a weakness. So.
Thank you, sir, for this enlightening talk. I am Shivam Hariwala, a political science student. As you already mentioned that the idea of India itself is a colonial connotation. But don't you think when we talk about Hindustan, that suddenly a picture of Indian territorial land comes to our mind? Indian territorial land, when we say the Hindustan, word Hindustan, then that too has a colonial connotation. Because it talks about the territorial limitation of the land of a modern nation state. Don't you think that too idea of Hindustan is somewhat a colonial connotation? What's your take on that? It is very much similar to the idea of India. It has become what it is now. I hope you understand what I'm trying to say.
I think it's not basically. I think the equation of the two. I mean that is precisely why I'm sort of leaning on this book. Basically, the argument is precisely that the two are different. That the notion of Hindustan that is there in the pre-colonial archive is not the same as the conception of India. Right? And the most radical difference is in terms of, beauty, harmony, and so on and so forth, as opposed to endless strife. All right? These are not the same thing.
But imagine when we think of Hindustan, then suddenly the picture of India might comes to our mind. How to deal with or how to confront this mentality of colonialism? I think my question here is that the fight with the mentality. Whether you call it Hindustan or India, of course, it has a different history and the picture of the history is completely different than Hindustan and India. But somewhat, even in modern times, the activeness of a modern nation state is so much high that we cannot even come out from the colonial connotation. That's what I'm trying to say.
Fair enough. It's a struggle. I mean, of course. I mean, see, even in this fellow's sense, the recovery of Hindustan, his attempt to excavate the concept of Hindustan, to say that the historians have lost something in being unable to conceptualize the place Hindustan. That instead of Hindustan, they do the history of India. And the two things are different. So the recovery of Hindustan in that sense as an intellectual concept, all right, is something that is intellectual work, really, But you're quite right. I mean, otherwise, the idea of the colonial has a way of colonizing everything, basically. So that India is colonized, Hindustan is colonial, the only thing that is left, Bharat. All right? But I think what is needed is slightly more fine-grained, to differentiate, to use the two concepts differently rather than running them together. So.
Thank you, Professor Rai. Thank you, sir, for this interesting discussion and topic, and I'm sure the conversation can always go on. So, thank you so much.
हम शाम के अपने दूसरे मेहमान पद्मश्री अनवर खान मांगनियार और लोक गायक कलाकारों की उनकी मंडली का स्वागत करना चाहते हैं। अनवर खान के साथ हैं उनकी मंडली में मंजूर खान ढोलक पे, भूंगर खान ढोलक, रोशन खान हारमोनियम एंड वोकल, रफीक खान कमायचा, जहीर खान मोरचंग और खूरताल, फिरोज खान खरताल। मांगनियार वंशानुगत लोक संगीतकारों का एक काबिला है। जो मुख्य रूप से पश्चिमी राजस्थान में रहते हैं। उनका संगीत पीढ़ियों से रेगिस्तान के टीलों में बहता है। अपने संरक्षकों के जीवन से घनिष्ठ रूप से बंधे राजस्थान के ये लोक कलाकार अपने गीतों में अपनी भूमि की लोक परंपराओं को संरक्षित करते हैं और इस अवसर के अनुरूप ध्वनियों के साथ हर जीवित क्षण का जश्न मनाते हैं। यह वास्तव में जादुई है कि ये कला सीखने की मौखिक परंपरा के माध्यम से एक पीढ़ी से दूसरी पीढ़ी तक गुजरते हैं। संगीत मंगनियारों की डीएनए में चलता है, इतना कि यह कहा जाता है कि यहाँ की जब समुदाय में एक नवजात शिशु रोता है तो वह कभी भी बेसुरा नहीं होता। अनवर खान जो बया में पले पड़े हैं और अब बाड़मेर में रहते हैं, मांगनियारों के बीच सबसे प्रसिद्ध गायकों में से एक हैं। उन्हें कई पुरस्कारों से सम्मानित किया गया है। सबसे हाल ही में पद्मश्री है जो उन्हें उनके लोक संगीत के लिए दिया गया है। इस प्रसिद्ध मंडली को आज बड़ौदा में हमारे साथ उनकी अनूठी कलात्मकता का आनंद लेने का विशेष अधिकार प्राप्त है। हमें स्वागत है आप सबका।
इजाजत आज की शाम के सभी महान और आदरणीय महान परिवार का मैं शुक्रिया अदा करता हूँ। तो आज शाम इसमें महान भारत के पूरे दुनिया के महानों के महान संत बुद्धिमान गुणजन और सब सोचे हुए देश को चाहने वाले और बुजुर्ग हमारे आज उनके सामने हम हमारा लोक संगीत प्रस्तुत करने जा रहे हैं। बहुत बड़े इतिहासकार, साहित्यकार, बहुत बड़े लेखक, साइंटिस्ट और प्रोफेसर और हमारे गुरुजन, बुजुर्ग माताएं और बहनें, बहुत खुशी है हमें कि हम एक में लोक कलाकार हैं। जब तक जो पूरी मंडली लोक कलाकार हम इंडिया के हैं, हमें बहुत गर्व है हिंदुस्तान पर, इंडिया पर। मालिक का शुक्रिया अदा करते हैं कि हमारी संगीतकार जाति उन्होंने परंपरा से बनाया, कई पीढ़ियों से, कई सालों से। और उसमें एक और भी है कि जो जजमानी प्रथा हमारी, जहाँ कई सालों से, कई पीढ़ियों से हम गाते बजाते आ रहे हैं, हमें बहुत खुशी है, बहुत गर्व है। ये कभी जो संगीत ये खत्म नहीं होने वाला है, ये आप लोगों का सहयोग रहेगा हमारी जजमानी प्रथा का। और दूसरा जो आज ये हमें मौका दिया है, यहाँ हमें बहुत गर्व है, बहुत खुशी है कि हमारी एक ऐसी जजमानी प्रथा है तो हम गा रहे हैं बजा रहे हैं, और हमारे एक गर्व हो रहे हैं हिंदुस्तान और इंडिया पर कि हमारा जो इतिहास है कई पीढ़ियों का, कई सालों का, हमेशा के लिए भारत में उत्सव ही होता है, हमेशा के लिए खुशी का एक माहौल, तीज त्योहार, होली, दिवाली, हर एक दिन हमेशा के लिए शादियाँ वगैरह जो चलता रहता है, लिहाज ये सबसे अच्छा है। और हम इस आज गुजरात की धरती में, बापू की धरती में, तो हमें बहुत खुशी है। और मैं विशेष रूप से भारत सरकार का शुक्रिया अदा करता हूँ उस बुजुर्गों की मेहरबानी से, ये हमारे राजस्थान का, गुजरात का, पूरे भारत का सम्मान किया भारत सरकार ने, इसलिए बहुत गर्व है। और आने वाली पीढ़ी भी ये संदेश है कि अपने ही संगीत और अपने ही कल्चर में रहे, अपनी भाषा में, अपने ही शब्दों में, अपने ही आवाज और ताल बाजे और वेशभूषा में। लेकिन आज अभी फरमाया आदरणीय सम्मानीय आलोक जी, जाने साहब, वो सभी को फरमाया, बहुत बहुत बढ़िया, हमें बहुत खुशी हुई। ये हमारा इतिहास है। और आज हमारे प्रमुख विराजे जनाब गुलाम साहब, बहुत बड़े महान, उन्होंने हमारे कल्चर को सहयोग दिया, बढ़ावा। स्वर्गीय पद्मभूषण कोमलदार, उन्होंने ये सब आज 7 साल पहले उन्होंने किया, तब आज हम यहाँ मंच पर है। तो आप उनके साथ हैं तो इसलिए बहुत खुशी है। तो आज हम गा रहे हैं, कोई तो लगाई देगा आपकी मेहरबानी से। महाराज गजानंद आओ ने मेरे मंदिर में रंग पर साव, हमारे भारत का कल्चर का ये बहुत जरूरी है। मंदिर खान, रोशन खान, रफी खान, जय खान, हरियाणा जी नाच रहे हैं, अब भगवान के साथ में कौन रहे हैं, साधे में
कार्तिक जी आनंद सूँ कार्तिक जी आनंद सूँ ढोल बजाए सभी जती ढोल बजाए सभी जती ढोल बजाए सभी जती नाचे माला
ये भी गीत आपने सुना हुआ राजस्थान पासवान का गीत है मान लाल मान महान गुरुजनों के लिए एक है भजन मेरा बेटा है कि दुनिया में उन्होंने क्या किया और देश को एक संदेश दिया। कई सालों से आज हमारे जो देश में भगवान गौतम बुद्ध जी महान भगवान, उसके किसी के शब्द को कहने का ही नहीं, भगवान ही नहीं, उनकी मैंने आज पूरे परिवार से चर्चा सुनी। तो आपने उनकी जो अस्थियां और उनकी जो अस्थियां ला करके अभी तक उनके बुद्ध में रखी है, कई सालों से, कई पीढ़ियों से, कई सदियों से। वही परिवार उस गुरुजनों के लिए कि मैं भजन गा रहा हूँ, हम सब गा रहे हैं। हमारा लोग वादे अमस्ती वादे संगत में भगवान गाता था और आपने दादो साहब मालूश्री थे सागर का साहब उन्होंने एक कमाचे को मच मिलाया और कमाचे ने हमारे को मच दिलाया। बहुत पुराना वादी कई सालों से कई पीढ़ियों से ये पहले गुजरात में ही बनता था, राजस्थान में जैसलमेर बाड़मेर में ही है। और भी काम किया। बहुत बहुत शुक्रिया जो हमारे राजस्थान की संगीत एक ही होगा, सुर एक होता है, संगीत वालों की जात एक ही होती है और सुनने वाले वो सबसे महान होते हैं। जो भी हमारा थाई लोक संगीत में बहुत बड़े इज्जत और बड़ी मर्यादा से हमने सुना, देखा, बहुत बहुत शुक्रिया। और हम ये आप बुजुर्गों की हम हाजिरी देते रहे और हमें बहुत खुशी और बहुत गर्व है। वो भी आप भावुक माना सामने कर रहे हैं, बहुत खुशी। और ये पवित्रता की भूमि, पवित्र प्रांगण और पवित्रता का ये मंदिर, इसमें बहुत खुशी है।
और आप सबको बहुत बहुत शुक्रिया हमारी तरफ से, आप आए, हमारा सुंदर हो गया, मजा। थैंक यू सो मच, शुक्रिया आप सबको। I'd also like to once again thank Professor Alok. Thank you, sir, for being here. And so so gracious and inviting me. It's been a real pleasure. And thank you all dear friends for being here today with us. Just would like to make a mention of some very dear friends who always been there for us, helping us to do this event. Dushan Taijawala, Jitendra Thakkar, Sandhya Golekar Garjar, Atul Chakravarti, Ayutika Ahmad, I'm forgetting my own friend, Sachin Rashmi. Thank you all, thanks a ton. You've been really been helpful and it's always wonderful having you back. We'll be back next year as well. Thank you.